Imagine waking up to discover your neighbor dead. By sunset, 3 more families on your street are gone. Within a week, the church bells never stop ringing. The gravediggers can't keep up. The doctors are dying alongside their patients. No one knows what is happening. Some blame poisoned wells. Others accuse strangers, witches, or the wrath of God. But the truth is even more terrifying. An invisible killer has arrived. A microscopic bacterium hitching rides on fleas, rodents, and in some forms of the disease, spreading from person to person through infectious droplets. It doesn't care whether you're a king or a peasant. It doesn't care how rich, how powerful, or how faithful you are. Over the next few years, it will wipe out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population, killing tens of millions of people
across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Entire villages will disappear. Economies will collapse. Families will vanish. And history itself will never be the same. For centuries, people believed this catastrophe was simply God's punishment. Today, science tells a different story. Ancient DNA recovered from plague victims, combined with historical records, has allowed researchers to identify the culprit and reconstruct much of how the pandemic spread. Yet many popular myths about the Black Death still persist. This is the verified story of history's deadliest plague.
The year is 1347. The Mediterranean is the beating heart of international trade. Merchant ships travel constantly between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and something no one can see. In October, several merchant galleys arrive at the bustling Sicilian port of Messina. At first, dock workers are simply relieved to see the ships. Trade means food. Trade means money. Trade means survival. But as sailors stagger off the vessels, something is terribly wrong.
Many can barely stand. Some collapse onto the docks. Others are burning with fever. Their skin is covered with dark blotches. Painful, swollen lumps, later known as buboes, bulge beneath their arms, around their necks, and in their groins. Many are coughing blood. Some die before they even leave the harbor. The horrified citizens order the ships to leave immediately. It is already too late. The disease has arrived. What no one realizes is that the ships have brought more than 6 sailors. Hidden below deck are black rats carrying fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Even where rats were not the primary drivers, infected fleas and human movement helped carry the disease onward. In some outbreaks, especially when the infection reached the lungs as pneumonic plague, it could spread directly between people through respiratory droplets. Within days, people in Messina begin falling ill. Then nearby towns. Then the rest of Sicily. Panic spreads faster than facts. Families barricade themselves inside their homes. Merchants abandon their goods. Priests rush from house to house administering last rites, unknowingly exposing themselves to more victims. Doctors have no idea what they are fighting. Some recommend burning fragrant herbs. Others prescribe bloodletting. Some insist the disease is caused by foul air. None of it works. Every sunrise reveals more bodies. Every sunset ends with another funeral. Soon, there aren't enough coffins, or enough priests, or enough graveyards. Mass graves become the only solution. Yet the most frightening part is not how deadly the disease is. It's how quickly it travels. Because Messina is only the beginning.
The same merchant routes that made
Europe's wealthy are now carrying death to every major port. Ships leave Sicily for Genoa, for Venice, for Marseille, for Barcelona. Each one unknowingly carries infected passengers, rodents, fleas, or all three. Wherever they dock, the pattern repeats. A few unexplained deaths, then dozens, then hundreds. Within months, one of the greatest pandemics in human history is sweeping across continents. But the plague did not begin in Europe. Its story starts thousands of kilometers away, across the vast trade networks linking East and West. To understand how an entire continent was brought to its knees, we must travel back to the great caravan routes of Asia, where history's deadliest journey truly began.
For centuries, one question has haunted historians. Where did the Black Death actually come from? The answer isn't as simple as many people think. For generations, historians believed the plague began somewhere in China before sweeping westward along the Silk Road. It seemed to make sense. The Mongol Empire connected much of Eurasia, allowing merchants, armies, and caravans to travel farther and faster than ever before. But history is rarely that straightforward. In recent years, scientists studying ancient DNA have uncovered remarkable new evidence. Buried in a quiet cemetery near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan, archaeologists discovered gravestones dating to 1338 and 1339. Several inscriptions mentioned only one cause of death: pestilence. For decades, no one knew exactly what that meant. Then, researchers extracted DNA from the teeth of people buried there. The results were astonishing. They found genetic traces of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium
responsible for the Black Death. Even more remarkable, the strain appears to sit very close to the ancestral lineage from which the devastating pandemic later emerged. It doesn't prove the pandemic began in that exact village, but it strongly suggests that Central Asia, not Western Europe, was at the heart of the outbreak's early history. The region was home to wild rodent populations, including marmots and other small mammals, which can naturally harbor plague bacteria. Even today, plague survives in animal reservoirs in parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. In other words, the Black Death wasn't created by humans. It was waiting in nature.
Imagine endless grasslands stretching beyond the horizon. Merchants lead camel caravans across deserts. Horsemen race through mountain passes. Silk, tea, spices, gold, ideas, religions. Everything moves along these routes, including disease. The Silk Road wasn't one road. It was a vast network connecting civilizations from East Asia to the Mediterranean. Every caravan stopped at busy trading towns. Every trader met hundreds of strangers. Every wagon carried food, clothing, animals, and occasionally invisible passengers. An infected flea doesn't understand kingdoms.
A bacterium doesn't recognize borders. It simply follows opportunity. And the Silk Road offered endless opportunities. By the early 1300s, the Mongol Empire had become the largest contiguous land empire in history. Its rulers controlled enormous stretches of Eurasia. Ironically, the empire brought something the world had rarely experienced: relative peace.
Historians often call this period the Pax Mongolica. Merchants could travel more safely than ever before. Trade flourished. Cities became wealthier. Cultures exchanged knowledge at unprecedented levels. It was one of history's
greatest periods of globalization. But globalization has always had a hidden cost. The same roads carrying silk could carry sickness. The same ships carrying spices could carry infected rodents. The same prosperity that united continents also connected epidemics. Without realizing it, one of history's greatest trade networks had become the perfect highway for one of history's deadliest diseases. Then came a city that would change everything. A thriving trading colony on the northern coast of the Black Sea. A city called Kaffa. Today, it is known as Feodosia in Crimea. In the 1340s, Kaffa was controlled by merchants from the Italian city of Genoa. Its harbor overflowed with goods from every corner of Eurasia. If you wanted wealth, you came to Kaffa. But in 1346, the city found itself under siege.
An army of the Golden Horde, one of the successor states of the Mongol Empire, surrounded its walls. The siege dragged on for months. Then, something unexpected happened. The attackers began dying. Not from arrows, not from starvation, but from plague. According to the medieval chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, the besieging forces hurled plague victims' bodies toward the city. Whether this happened exactly as described remains debated among historians, but the account reflects the fear and chaos surrounding the outbreak. What is far less disputed is that plague was present around Kaffa, and that fleeing merchants left the city by sea. Their destination? The ports of the Mediterranean. Among them, Messina.
The city where our story began. The plague had crossed continents. Now it was about to conquer Europe. And Europe had absolutely no idea what was coming. Because the worst wasn't the first wave. The worst was how people would respond when civilization itself began to collapse. The plague had reached Europe, but no one, not kings, merchants, priests, or physicians, could imagine what would happen next. This wasn't just another outbreak. Europe had endured disease before. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, and countless local epidemics were grim facts of medieval life. But this was different. It moved with terrifying speed, and once it arrived, it rarely left without leaving entire communities shattered. Within weeks of reaching Sicily in late 1347, merchant ships carried the infection to other major ports across the Mediterranean. The bustling docks of Genoa, the wealthy canals of Venice, the crowded streets of Marseille, the ports of Barcelona. Every ship that unloaded its cargo brought with it the possibility of unseen infection. Trade had made Europe rich. Now trade was delivering catastrophe. At first, many cities believed they had escaped. A handful of deaths didn't seem unusual. People fell ill all the time. But then the numbers began to climb. 10 deaths became 50. 50 became hundreds. Within weeks, entire neighborhoods were mourning their dead. Church bells rang from dawn until dusk. Soon, they rang so often that many churches simply stopped. There was no point. Everyone already knew what the bells meant. Death.
The plague spread not only along coastlines, but inland.
As merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and travelers moved from town to town, busy market roads became corridors of infection. An innkeeper welcomed exhausted travelers. Days later, his family became sick. A merchant delivered cloth to a distant village. Soon, the village was burying its own. Every handshake, every shared meal, every crowded marketplace created another opportunity for the disease to spread. Communities that had never heard of Messina or Kaffa suddenly found themselves trapped in the same nightmare. Then came the hardest realization
Of all, there was nowhere to run. Some families fled into the countryside, hoping distance would save them. Occasionally, it did. Often, it didn't. Many unknowingly carried the disease with them. The plague followed roads, rivers, and trade routes, reaching places that had seemed safely isolated. What had begun as scattered outbreaks was becoming a continental disaster. As fear spread, so did rumor. Some claimed poisonous vapors had risen from the earth. Others believed a rare alignment of the planets had corrupted the air. Many saw the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Without microscopes or knowledge of bacteria, these explanations felt convincing. People desperately searched for meaning. Because accepting the alternative, that an invisible force could kill anyone at any moment, was almost impossible. The uncertainty changed human behavior. Neighbors avoided one another. Parents feared their own children might be infected. Doors remained locked. Markets emptied. The sounds of laughter disappeared from streets that had once been full of life. Trust began to collapse alongside public health. Some physicians stayed and treated the sick despite enormous personal risk. Others fled before the disease reached its peak. Clergy faced impossible choices as they comforted the dying, knowing every visit could expose them to infection. No profession was untouched. The wealthy often believed they could escape. Some nobles abandoned crowded cities for country estates. A few survived because of isolation. Many did not. The plague ignored titles. Kings could die. Bishops could die.
Merchants could die. Farmers could die. For perhaps the first time on such a massive scale, society witnessed a disease that treated humanity with terrifying equality. One of the most famous eyewitnesses, the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, described families abandoning one another in fear and neighborhoods falling silent as the epidemic swept through Florence. His account is vivid and influential, though like many personal narratives, it reflects one observer's perspective rather than every community's experience. Across Europe, however, many chroniclers tell a similar story. Hospitals overflowed. Gravediggers worked until they collapsed. Entire households vanished. In some places, there were too few living people left to bury the dead. Mass graves became a grim necessity. The normal rhythms of life, work, worship, marriage, trade, gave way to survival. And yet, amid the horror, something even more frightening puzzled everyone. The disease didn't always look the same. Some victims lingered for days. Others seemed healthy in the morning and were dead by nightfall. Some developed enormous swollen bubones. Others coughed blood.
until they suffocated. Why did the plague strike in such different ways? The answer lay inside the human body. And once medieval physicians saw what the disease could do, many believed they were witnessing the end of the world.
Imagine waking up, feeling perfectly healthy. Perhaps you're a merchant, preparing for the day's market. A farmer, ready to work the fields. A child, chasing friends through the village. Nothing seems unusual. Then, without warning, a fever begins. At first, it's easy to ignore. You tell yourself, you'll feel better tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes. Within hours, your body is burning. Your muscles ache with unbearable pain. Your head pounds. Every movement feels heavier than the last. You can barely stand. Then, something stranger happens. Deep beneath your skin,
Small lumps begin to form. By the end of the day, they've grown into painful swellings, the size of eggs or even apples. These are buboes, swollen lymph nodes caused by the body's desperate attempt to fight the infection. They often appear in the groin, under the arms, or around the neck. The pain is so intense that even the weight of clothing can become unbearable. For many medieval people, these terrifying swellings became the unmistakable sign that death was near. Today, doctors call this form of the disease bubonic plague. It is the most familiar form of plague and is typically spread by the bite of an infected flea. Without modern antibiotics, many infected people in the 14th century did not survive. But bubonic plague was only one face of the disease. For some victims,
the nightmare became even worse. As the bacteria multiplied, they sometimes entered the bloodstream. Once that happened, the infection could spread rapidly throughout the body. This is known as septicemic plague. Tiny blood vessels became damaged. The body's organs began to fail. Areas of skin could turn dark as blood flow was disrupted. It is from these darkened patches that the name Black Death is thought by some to have gained part of its later association, although historians note that the medieval term more commonly referred to the catastrophe's dreadful nature rather than skin discoloration alone. Victims often became weak so quickly that there was little anyone could do. Some died before buboes had even fully developed. But there was one form of plague that terrified people above all others. When the infection reached the lungs, it became pneumonic plague. Victims struggled to breathe. Violent coughing fits filled the air. Some coughed up blood. Unlike bubonic plague, which usually required infected fleas to spread, pneumonic plague could pass directly from one person to another through infectious respiratory droplets during close contact. Suddenly, every conversation, every prayer, every attempt to comfort a dying loved one could become another opportunity for infection. Families trying to care for one another unknowingly placed themselves in danger. Acts of compassion carried unimaginable risk. Medieval physicians had no understanding of bacteria. The microscope had not yet revealed the invisible world of microbes. No one knew about pathogens. No one understood infection.
No one had antibiotics. Instead, doctors relied on the medical theories of their age.
Many believed illness resulted from an imbalance of the body's humors. Others blamed poisonous air, known as miasma. To protect themselves, physicians wore long robes, gloves, and the now famous beaked masks packed with aromatic herbs. Although these plague doctor costumes became iconic, they were more common during later plague outbreaks than during the first Black Death of the 1340s. The herbs could not stop the bacteria, but they reflected humanity's desperate search for protection against something it could not understand. People tried everything. Bonfires filled city squares in hopes of cleansing the air. Homes were fumigated with herbs and incense. Perfumes were carried in cloth pouches. Some believed loud noises could drive away disease. Others swallowed strange medicines made from crushed minerals, plants, or animal products. Bloodletting remained a common treatment. In some places, physicians applied hot irons to swollen buboes. Patients endured agonizing procedures that offered little real chance of recovery. Most treatments were based on sincere medical beliefs of the time, but none addressed the true cause
of the disease. Fear spread almost as quickly as the plague itself. Parents hesitated before embracing sick children. Friends avoided lifelong companions. Even funeral rituals changed. The dead were often buried quickly because lingering near the body was considered dangerous. Communities that had once gathered in celebration now gathered only to mourn, and sometimes not even that. Entire households died with no one left alive to bury them. Yet amid the horror, another disease was taking hold, not in the body, but in the human mind. As death became impossible to explain, fear turned into suspicion. Neighbors began accusing neighbors. Foreigners became targets. Minority communities were blamed without evidence. False rumors spread faster than facts. History would remember the Black Death not only as a medical catastrophe, but also as one of humanity's greatest moral tests. And in many places, humanity failed.
As the death toll climbed, Europe searched desperately for answers. But in the 14th century, there were no laboratories, no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria. And when people cannot explain catastrophe, they often create explanations of their own. Some believed the end of the world had arrived. Others insisted the stars had turned against humanity. Astrologers blamed the heavens. Preachers warned that God was punishing mankind for its sins. Doctors argued over poisoned air and corrupted blood. Everyone had a theory. Almost no one had the truth.
Then came something even more dangerous than ignorance: fear. History has shown time and again that fear can spread faster than any disease. As entire communities watched friends and relatives die, panic began to erode the foundations of society. Whispers became accusations. Accusations became violence. Across parts of Europe, rumors spread that certain minority communities had deliberately poisoned wells to cause the plague. There was no evidence for these claims. Modern historians are unequivocal. The accusations were false. Yet, in an age of terror and uncertainty, many people accept
them as fact. The consequences were devastating. Jewish communities, in particular, became targets of persecution. In numerous towns across Europe, innocent men, women, and children were attacked, expelled, or murdered after being falsely blamed for the pandemic. Some communities had lived peacefully alongside their neighbors for generations. That history offered little protection when fear took over. One of the most infamous examples occurred in Strasbourg in 1349. Remarkably, the massacre took place before the plague had even
Reached the city in full force. Hundreds of Jews were killed or driven from their homes based on fabricated accusations. It stands as one of the darkest chapters associated with the Black Death, not because of the disease itself, but because of the choices people made in response to it. Not everyone joined the violence. Some local rulers tried to protect threatened communities. Certain religious and civic leaders condemned the false accusations. Even Pope Clement VI issued statements rejecting the claim that Jews had caused the plague, pointing out that the disease was affecting Jewish communities as well. But reason struggled to compete with panic. When death seemed to be
Everywhere, many people preferred certainty, even false certainty, to the frightening reality that no one was in control. Elsewhere, another movement emerged. Bands of religious penitents, known as flagellants, began traveling from town to town. They believed humanity had brought God's wrath upon itself. Their solution was public acts of penance. They marched through streets, whipping their own backs with leather straps and metal-tipped cords, convinced that suffering would persuade God to end the plague. Crowds gathered to watch. Some joined them.
Others believed these dramatic displays offered hope. In reality, the processions often brought large groups of people together, creating new opportunities for disease to spread. What was intended as salvation may, in some places, have helped the epidemic continue. As trust collapsed, ordinary life became almost unrecognizable. Courts closed. Schools fell silent. Trade slowed dramatically. Fields went untilled because there were too few healthy workers left. Livestock wandered unattended. Harvests were abandoned. The economy itself began to fracture. For survivors, hunger increasingly joined disease as another deadly threat. Even the church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, faced an unprecedented crisis. Priests continued visiting the sick, hearing confessions, and conducting funerals. Many died alongside those they served. As clergy succumbed to the plague, some communities were left without spiritual leaders. For many believers, it raised painful questions. Why would God allow such suffering? Why were devoted priests dying alongside criminals? Why did prayer save some people, but not others? These questions would echo for generations, slowly reshaping religious thought across Europe. Yet amid the despair, remarkable acts of courage also appeared. Doctors who knew they might never return home still treated patients. Nuns cared for abandoned children. Neighbors shared food with families trapped in quarantine. Strangers buried the dead when no relatives remained. History remembers the horrors of the Black Death, but it also remembers those who chose compassion when fear offered an easier path. As the epidemic continued, another astonishing transformation began to unfold. At first, it seemed impossible to notice. How could anything positive emerge from such unimaginable loss? But as the years passed,
The massive decline in population started to change Europe in ways no king had planned and no army could have achieved. The plague had not only killed millions, it had changed the balance of power itself, and the survivors would inherit a very different world.
When the worst of the Black Death finally began to pass, Europe looked familiar. The same castles still stood. The same cathedrals still pierced the sky. The same kings still claimed their thrones. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. The plague had not simply killed people. It had removed millions of them. Entire villages had vanished from the map. Some houses would never again have smoke rising from their chimneys. Fields that had fed generations lay abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Roads that once
echoed with merchants and pilgrims, had fallen silent. For survivors, the world felt strangely empty. Before the Black Death, medieval Europe had a large population. Landholders held immense power. Most peasants had little choice but to work for low wages or provide labor under the feudal system. Workers were plentiful. Individual lives, economically speaking, were often considered replaceable. Then, the plague shattered that balance. In many regions, there simply were not enough workers left. Fields still needed harvesting. Roads still needed repairing. Castles still needed servants. But the laborers who had done those jobs were gone. For the first time in generations, the survivors held something incredibly valuable: their labor. Landowners who had once dictated every condition suddenly found themselves competing for workers. Wages began to rise in many places. Some peasants negotiated better conditions. Others left their old lords altogether in search of higher pay elsewhere. It was a remarkable shift, not because kings had passed new laws, but because the plague had changed the basic economics of supply and demand. Human life had become scarce, and scarcity creates value.
Many rulers were alarmed. Higher wages threatened the traditional social order. In England, for example, the government attempted to freeze wages through the Statute of Laborers in 1351, requiring many workers to accept pre-plague pay levels. On paper, it looked like a solution. In reality, it was far harder to enforce. People understood their value now. Many ignored the restrictions or sought better opportunities elsewhere. The relationship between rulers and ordinary workers would never be quite the same again. The effects reached far beyond the countryside. Cities also changed. Guilds that had once been difficult to enter now needed skilled workers. Some survivors inherited homes, businesses, or land from relatives who had died. For certain families, tragedy unexpectedly brought economic opportunity. This did not erase the grief, but it did reshape society. Wealth began to move in new directions. The rigid structures of medieval life became just a little less rigid. The church also faced profound challenges. Thousands of priests had died while caring for plague victims. Replacing them quickly was nearly impossible. In some areas, younger and less experienced clergy filled the gaps. At the same time,
many survivors struggled with difficult questions. If prayer alone could not stop the plague, if good people died alongside the wicked, if entire monasteries could disappear, what did that mean about God's plan? These questions did not destroy religious faith, but they encouraged deeper debate and, over the centuries, contributed to broader movements of religious reform and intellectual change.
Art changed too. Before the plague, much European art celebrated triumph, saints, and eternal glory. After the Black Death, artists increasingly reflected on mortality. Skeletons appeared in paintings. Hourglasses reminded viewers that time was fleeting. Stories emphasized the uncertainty of life. One famous artistic theme became known as the Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. In these images, kings, queens, merchants, priests, and peasants all danced together with skeletons. The message was unmistakable. Death spared no one. Even medicine began, slowly,
to evolve. The Black Death did not immediately lead to the discovery of bacteria. That would take centuries. But repeated outbreaks encouraged cities to develop new public health measures. Some ports required arriving ships to wait before passengers could disembark. This practice became known as quarantine, a word derived from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40, referring to the 40-day isolation period imposed in some places. It was one of the earliest organized attempts to limit the spread of infectious disease. Without knowing the true cause of plague, communities had discovered that limiting contact could save lives. It was an imperfect solution, but it was a beginning. Then came another surprising realization. The Black Death never truly disappeared. Although the great pandemic of the 14th century eventually subsided, Yersinia pestis continued to survive in wild animal populations. Over the centuries, new outbreaks appeared in different parts of the world. One of the most devastating later epidemics struck London in 1665. Another major pandemic began in China during the 19th century before spreading globally. The bacterium had not vanished. It had merely retreated into nature. Even today, plague still exists in a small number of countries, usually among wild rodents. Human cases are now rare, and when diagnosed promptly, modern antibiotics are highly effective. The disease that once terrified continents has not been erased. Humanity has simply learned how to fight it. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the Black Death was never about the bacteria. It was about us. The pandemic revealed both the best and the worst of humanity. It exposed fear, hatred, greed, courage, compassion, sacrifice. Every human emotion emerged under the pressure of unimaginable loss. And those lessons remain surprisingly relevant, because history has a way of repeating itself, not always in the same form, but often in the same patterns. Nearly 700 years have passed since the first plague ships reached the shores of Europe. The ports of Messina, Genoa, and Venice are once again filled with travelers. The villages that survived have become modern towns. The kingdoms that fought over medieval Europe have long since disappeared. But the Black Death has never truly left us. Not because the disease still rages across continents, but because its legacy is woven into the modern world.
Walk through any major city today, and you'll see hospitals designed to isolate infectious patients. Governments monitor outbreaks across borders. Scientists sequence the DNA of dangerous pathogens. Public health officials trace contacts and investigate new cases before they spread. None of these systems existed in 1347. They were built slowly and painfully over centuries of
Experience with epidemics, including plague. Every lesson learned came at a terrible cost. The Black Death also transformed the way historians understand civilization. For centuries, history was often told through the lives of kings, queens, generals, and conquerors. But the plague reminds us that history can also be shaped by something no one can negotiate with. An invisible bacterium changed Europe more profoundly than many wars. It altered economies, reshaped labor, influenced religion, changed art, accelerated social
change, and left scars that lasted for generations. Sometimes, the greatest force in history isn't an empire, it's biology. Modern science has answered questions that medieval people never could. Researchers have extracted ancient DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in medieval cemeteries. They have traced the evolution of Yersinia pestis through time. They have identified animal reservoirs where the bacterium still survives in nature. They have shown that plague was not a supernatural curse. It was a disease, one with a biological cause that can now be diagnosed and, in most cases, successfully treated with antibiotics if caught early. For the people of the 14th century, that knowledge came centuries too late.
Yet one mystery remains. Why did the Black Death kill so many people? Historians and scientists point to several factors working together. Europe's population had grown rapidly before the pandemic. Many communities were densely populated. Poor sanitation was common. Trade networks connected distant regions. Medical knowledge was limited. And once the disease began spreading, people had few effective ways to stop it. The catastrophe was not caused by a single mistake. It was the result of multiple vulnerabilities colliding at once.
Perhaps the most haunting lesson is not medical. It is human. The Black Death revealed two very different sides of society. On one side, there was fear, false accusations, violence against innocent people, panic, desperation. On the other, there was extraordinary courage. Doctors who stayed, nuns who cared for abandoned children, neighbors who shared their last food, gravediggers who continued working when almost everyone else fled. Ordinary people who chose compassion, even when compassion placed their own lives at risk. History remembers both, and every generation must decide which example it will follow.
The plague also changed how people viewed life itself. After witnessing death on such an unimaginable scale, many survivors embraced new opportunities. Artists painted with renewed urgency. Merchants took greater risks. Families rebuilt. Communities recovered. Life returned, not because the suffering had been forgotten, but because humanity has always possessed a remarkable ability to endure. Civilizations fall, cities burn,
Empires collapse.
Pandemics come and go, yet people rebuild again and again and again. Today, the Black Death is often remembered only as a number. 30 million, 40 million, perhaps 50 million or more across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But numbers can hide the human story. Each statistic was a person, someone's mother, someone's son, a farmer with dreams of a better harvest, a merchant planning one more voyage, a child who never reached adulthood. The true tragedy of the Black Death isn't simply how many died. It's how many lives were interrupted.
And yet, against all odds, humanity survived. The plague that once seemed unstoppable did not end civilization. It changed it. It forced societies to adapt. It exposed weaknesses. It inspired innovations. And it left behind lessons that still shape how we respond to disease today. The Black Death was not merely history's deadliest plague. It was one of history's greatest turning points. It proved that the smallest organisms can change the fate of the mightiest empires. It showed that knowledge saves lives, while fear and misinformation can make disasters even worse. And it reminded us that even in humanity's darkest hours, courage and compassion endure. The bells that once tolled across medieval Europe have long fallen silent. The mass graves now lie beneath fields, churches, and city streets. But if we listen closely, their story still speaks. Not as a warning from the past, but as a lesson for the future. Because history is not only about remembering those who came before us, it is about learning from them and ensuring that when the next great challenge arrives, we meet it not with panic, but with wisdom.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Empire of Secrets for more forgotten histories, lost civilizations, unsolved mysteries, and the darkest chapters of the ancient world. Because history is full of secrets, and we're just getting started.